Honda ended its latest stint in F1 on a high, as Max Verstappen claimed the manufacturer's first world championship in well over 2 decades. And this season, it seems like they're all set to make a big comeback, just not in a way that you'd expect. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into Honda's latest F1 plans and what they imply in the long run. First up, the Honda name will be prominent at Suzuka. Honda's 7-year spell in the turbo-hybrid era was nothing but rocky. The first few years were plagued by reliability issues as teams struggled to provide sufficient cooling to their engines. By the end, however, they were the fastest on the grid, and even though they missed out on the Constructors' Championship, winning the driver's title with Max Verstappen was still a massive achievement. Of course, they're no longer in F1, well, officially anyway. Most of the current Red Bull engine is still more or less manufactured by Honda. It's just that the Japanese brand has stopped associating its name with it. Now, speaking of associating names, it seems like Honda just couldn't live without attaching its name to F1 in some capacity. No, the car manufacturer is not returning as an engine supplier anytime soon, especially after the way it exited the sport. What it's returning as, though, is the main sponsor for the upcoming Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. In a press release earlier this week, the Suzuka circuit announced that this year's edition of the Japanese race would be officially called Formula One Honda Japanese Grand Prix 2022. Interestingly, apart from the name itself, the logo for the race weekend in October also has Honda written next to the F1 logo in the red font, meaning that they're really pushing the brand front and center. It's also worth noting that this is the first time that we'll be heading back to Japan since 2019, as the previous 2 races were canceled due to complications with the pandemic. All in all, it'll be interesting to see how deep Honda's involvement is at Suzuka. So, will Honda ever return as an engine manufacturer? While Honda didn't have the most successful stints in Formula One, its time in the sport was still enjoyable for the most part. Plus, the engine manufacturer was also a part of some of the most iconic F1 moments last season as it clinched the title with Red Bull. And despite its reluctance to come back to the sport anytime soon, you can't completely rule out a return in the future. After all, never say never, right? Oh, and it's not all speculation either, as Honda has actually commented on the future prospects of returning as an engine manufacturer. According to Honda Motorsports boss Masashi Yamamoto, there's a good chance that they'll eventually come back for a 5th stint in the sport, but it all comes down to one thing: passion. Speaking to F1.com, Yamamoto said that he personally hopes to return one day. However, he added that it's not really up to him to make the decision, as the young people who are working at Honda need to be up to the task for it to happen. He explained that if they're passionate enough about making engines for an F1 car again, then they can perhaps convince the senior management to make a move. Now, Honda's been pretty successful in the past, winning 6 Constructors' Championships and 5 Drivers' Championships with Williams and McLaren in the 80s and 90s. The latest stint in 2015 with McLaren, however, wasn't quite what they'd hoped for, and it took a move to Red Bull 5 years later for them to finally bag a podium again. Obviously, we know what happened next, but by the time Max won the championship, the Japanese carmaker was already on its way out. Next, Honda's already got the tools in place for a swift F1 comeback. We know how hard it is for any engine manufacturer to enter the sport, especially as its own team. For instance, Porsche is currently trying to find a passage into F1, but even if we're being super liberal with our guess, it's probably going to take at least 5 or 6 years before we see the German manufacturer in the sport. Of course, it's much easier if you're not trying to set up an entire team and just want to supply an engine. But at that point, the returns just aren't that great, and the risk is too high. Well, that would be the case if you're an outsider anyway. Honda's case, on the other hand, is a bit different. You see, even though the Japanese manufacturers quote-unquote officially left the sport, it's still producing engines for Red Bull. Yes, it's called Red Bull Powertrains now, but most of the people working on the power unit are still Honda employees. Plus, even the tech is mostly Honda engineered. So they've still got all the systems in place for manufacturing an F1 engine. It's just that they've ripped the Honda label off of them. Obviously, it's easier said than done since there's still tons and tons of hurdles that you've got to cross, especially with the FIA, to get back into the engine-making business. But if anyone's capable of doing it, it's Honda. Now, having the ability to return and actually wanting to come back are 2 very different things. So it'd be super interesting to see whether we see any movement from the Japanese manufacturer within the next year or so. If Red Bull keeps winning races like they've been so far, though, it's going to be very hard for Honda to resist a share in its glory. Time for some other related news. Starting with, Russell expresses disappointment over lack of victories. Mercedes has been the dominant force in Formula One for almost a decade at this point. However, the new era with these ground effect cars has kinda set the 8-time Constructors' Champions back, as they're nowhere near the front of the grid. In fact, these days, it's a miracle if they can even get to the podium. That's just how it goes in sport though, as you can't keep winning forever. Now, Lewis Hamilton has won everything with Mercedes, so he's not bothered by the team's poor results. After all, he knows that they've got got what it takes to come back stronger next season. George Russell, on the other hand, doesn't seem too pleased with his start to life in the Mercedes garage. According to him, the lack of victories has been a bit disappointing, as he'd hoped to launch a title challenge when he signed for the team. Speaking to the press before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, the British driver said that if you'd told him at the end of last season that he'd be 7 races in without a single race win to his name, he would have been pretty disappointed. However, he did repeat that even though the Silver Arrows haven't been scoring race wins, he's still happy with his performance, especially when you consider how far behind they are in terms of sheer pace. Obviously, being the only driver on the grid with top 5 finishes in all the races so far this season, Russell's record isn't too shabby. With that said, he still belongs in the thick of the title fight against the likes of Verstappen and Leclerc. And now, Andretti isn't too happy about the lack of respect from F1 teams. Over the past couple of months, Michael Andretti's been hard at work to set up an 11th Formula One team, and while his efforts aren't progressing as fast as he had hoped, he's still on track to bring the legendary motorsport name to F1. His father and former world champion Mario Andretti, however, isn't too happy about the way they're being treated by other teams. According to him, the FIA's been super open with him, and they fulfilled the association's requirements too. The current teams on the paddock, though, are proving to be a bit of a hurdle for them. For context, top teams like Red Bull and Mercedes think that if the F1 management were to introduce a new team to the grid, it would dilute the prize pool. And even if they pay the new entrant fee, which is there to offset the dilution, by the way, it's still not enough of an assurance that they're bringing actual value to the sport. Andretti, however, thinks that this is a pretty disrespectful stance from the teams, as his team's been competitive in other forms of motorsport, including IndyCar. Finally, Mattia Binotto defends Ferrari's lack of competitive edge. One of the highlights of this season has been Ferrari's return to form, especially after the horrendous couple of seasons they've had lately. However, while the Scuderia pretty evenly matched with Red Bull in terms of pace, it seems like they've been lacking in other departments like strategy and planning. So far, we've already seen tons of instances where the Italian teams let easy race wins slip out of their hand. According to the team boss Mattia Binotto, though, winning the championship's never been the goal for them this season. Speaking to the press at Baku, he said that their objective for this season was always to be competitive in 2022. Now, being competitive is one thing, but winning the World Championship is a whole other task, so we kinda get his point. With that said, when you've got the pace to consistently challenge for race wins, you really gotta raise your ambitions, as F1 isn't a sport that rewards complacency. That's a wrap for this video. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.